There's a specific kind of quiet that comes with small towns in October. It's not the quiet of nothing happening. It's the quiet of everyone having already agreed, without saying it out loud, that certain things are better left alone. I grew up in a town like that. One of those places where most of the streets have names, but nobody uses them. You just say, down by the hardware store, or past the church with the broken clock, and everyone knows exactly where you mean. The kind of place that looks normal from the road and feels slightly off the longer you stay. The woods behind town were part of that feeling. They started at the back edge of the high school's property and ran for a few miles before hitting a ridge that most people treated as a natural stopping point. There were trails in the first section, a loop that the parks department maintained loosely, a creek path that flooded every spring and got fixed every fall, a picnic area with 3 tables and a trash can that was always full. Normal stuff. The kind of woods families used on Sunday afternoons before heading somewhere with heat and electricity. But the trails ended about a half-mile in. After that, the land changed. The ground got uneven. The trees grew closer together. The light came through differently. Not darker exactly, just thinner, like it was being rationed. People in town had a name for the deeper part. Not an official name, not something on a sign or a map, just what they called it when they wanted to explain why they had turned around. Evil spirits. That was the phrase. Always those 2 words, always in that order. My aunt used to say it at the trailhead while she locked her car. Not like a warning, more like a reminder to herself. Don't go too far back. Those woods got evil spirits. Then she'd hike the loop and come home fine and not mention it again. The man who ran the gas station on County Road 9 said it the same way he said everything, like he was making a joke and also meaning it completely. I'm telling you, man, that place has bad energy, evil spirits, like they're just waiting. Then he'd ring up your chips and not look you in the eye for a second. I heard it enough growing up that the words stopped meaning anything specific, and they just became the town's way of saying, something about those woods makes us uncomfortable, and we don't know how to explain it. I didn't believe in spirits, evil or otherwise. I believed in getting turned around in unfamiliar terrain, in people doing dumb things in the dark, in the way your brain can make something feel wrong, even when it isn't. The woods were woods. They had animals and roots and weather, and the occasional person with a bad reason for being out there. That was it, and that was my actual position, even if I also had an unspoken rule about not going in alone. I never said it out loud. I didn't want to sound like I was agreeing with the evil spirits crowd. But the rule was there. Not alone. Always headlamps. Always tell someone where you parked. Not because of anything supernatural. Because the woods were genuinely dangerous in practical ways, and I didn't want to be the person who had to get carried out. The person I went with most of the time was Jared. We'd been friends since middle school, the kind of friendship that survives mostly because neither of you ever gets too far away. He worked mornings at his uncle's garage and picked up side jobs doing oil changes and tire rotations out of his driveway. I was on a rotation of warehouse shifts and whatever my cousin could find for me, painting fences, clearing brush, hauling stuff out of rental properties when tenants left things behind. Neither of us was exactly thriving. Neither of us was doing badly enough to panic. We were in that stretch of your mid-20s that feels like a waiting room you haven't figured out how to leave. So we went to the woods the way you go anywhere when you don't have money for anything better, and the alternative is sitting inside doing nothing. We'd been doing it since we were 12. The routine was comfortable, which is its own kind of dangerous. The day we found the cave was a Tuesday in late October, 2 days after a windstorm that had come through fast and left everything scattered. Branches across roads, puddles in low spots, that sharp green smell in the air from trees that had been pulled apart. I was at home doing nothing useful when Jared sent me a message. He wanted to check if the creek was up from all the rain. That's the kind of plan that only makes sense if you don't have anything else going on. I didn't. By noon, I was in the passenger seat of his truck, a dented silver Ranger with a cracked dashboard and a gas gauge that read E at a quarter tank because the float was broken. We drove out to the pull-off by the old gate, 2 wooden posts and a length of rusty chain that people stepped over without thinking about. The town had put up a sign once, a laminated sheet of paper on a piece of plywood. No motorized vehicles beyond this point. Someone had written "No fun" underneath it in permanent marker, and the addition had been there so long it looked almost official. We signed in on the paper log at the kiosk because it was habit, and because neither of us wanted to be the reason someone spent 2 days searching the wrong section of woods. Then we went through. The first stretch was normal. The trail was clear, a little muddy in spots, with downed branches every 100 feet or so from the storm. The creek ran higher than usual, brown and fast, with foam collecting at the edges. We followed it the way we always did. Not because there was anything to see, but because a creek gives you a direction, and having a direction keeps you from walking in circles and arguing about it. We talked about ordinary things. His uncle was thinking about expanding the garage. My cousin had a contract job lined up that might turn into something longer. The storm had taken out a section of fence at the park, and the town hadn't fixed it yet. Nothing interesting, just the kind of talking you do when you're comfortable with someone and not trying to fill silence with anything in particular. About 40 minutes in, the trail ended the way it always did. Just stopped, absorbed by uneven ground and trees that were too close together for a clear path. We kept going because we always kept going. The ground got rockier. The trees shifted to older growth, the kind with roots that ran along the surface and tripped you if you weren't watching. Flat shelves of stone pushed up through the soil in places, gray and moss-covered, wet from the rain. The storm had done more damage back here. A big oak had come down, not snapped, but pulled completely out of the ground, root ball and all. It had taken 2 smaller trees with it, and the whole mass of roots and soil had swung out from the hillside like a door being pushed open. The dirt and rock it left behind was raw, dark, freshly exposed. Behind the root ball, where the hillside had been pulled away, there was an opening. I almost walked past it. It wasn't obvious. Just a dark area in the rock, oval-shaped, maybe 3 feet from the bottom of the gap to the top of the arch. It looked at first like a shadow under the roots, just a deep spot where the ground had collapsed a little. Jared noticed it before I did. He stopped, crouched, and looked at it for a long moment without saying anything, which was unusual for him, and then he pulled off his glove and brushed loose dirt away from the lower edge. Underneath the dirt, the rock was solid and continuous, not crumbled. The opening wasn't a collapse, It was an actual gap, with the kind of edges that meant something had been there for a long time before the storm uncovered it. He leaned in close and angled his head like he was trying to hear something. Then he leaned back and looked at me. "It goes back." I came down beside him and looked, and the opening was wider than it looked from a few feet away. 2 feet high at the lowest point, then maybe 4 at the top where the arch reached. Wide enough to get through if you ducked, wide enough to stand hunched once you were inside. The air coming out of it was cold. Not October cold, cellar cold, the kind that sits in the ground all year and doesn't change with the seasons. And underneath the cold, there was a smell. Not bad exactly, more like the smell under an old wooden board that's been sitting in dirt, wet and slow and closed off. I looked at the root ball. No other openings. No obvious signs that anyone had been here before. No footprints in the soft dirt around the edge. No trash. No old fire rings. The opening had been covered by that hillside for however long, and the storm had been the first thing to pull it open in what might have been a very long time. We had 2 headlamps each, 2 small flashlights, a basic first aid kit from Jared's truck, and a couple of water bottles. Not exactly caving gear, but we'd done dumb things before with less. I said we shouldn't go in. That's how that part of the conversation always went. And then we went in anyway. That's how the rest of the conversation always went. The rock scraped the back of my jacket as I ducked through. Inside, the smell was stronger. Cold mineral, damp stone, something underneath it that I couldn't name yet. Not bad enough to stop, just different enough to notice. The opening widened after a few feet. By the time my eyes adjusted to the headlamp beams, I could stand with my head ducked slightly, maybe a foot of clearance above me. The ceiling was close enough to feel, and water dripped in a slow, irregular pattern somewhere ahead. The floor was uneven but manageable. Loose stones, patches of slick mud, nothing we hadn't dealt with before. Jared went first, because he always went first, and I followed because that's what you do when you've been doing something together for long enough that the roles stop needing to be assigned. We went 10 feet. The opening behind us was still visible, a pale oval of gray afternoon light. Then 20 feet. The light behind us got smaller. Then the floor angled downward, and the temperature dropped another few degrees, and the sound of the creek outside disappeared completely, replaced by the sound of our footsteps and the dripping and our own breathing in a space that felt sealed off from the rest of the world. At 30 feet, I noticed a faint airflow, not a draft, just a small, irregular movement of air that touched my face every few seconds. Not constant, more like the cave was exhaling slowly. I noted it and didn't say anything about it. The passage leveled out. The ceiling rose. I could stand straight. And on the right-hand wall, where the stone was flatter, our headlamps picked out marks. I thought at first it was damage from the rock, stress fractures, layered sediment, the natural texture of stone. But Jared stopped and swung his light slowly across the surface, and the shapes came out of the texture the way shapes do when the angle of light is right. Handprints, not painted, pressed, like someone had pressed a palm covered in dark pigment flat against the stone and held it there. There were a dozen of them, maybe more, spread across a section of wall about as wide as a dining table. Different sizes, some barely bigger than a child's hand, some larger than mine, Between the handprints were lines, some straight, running in close groups like tally marks, some curved, and in the center of the grouping, a shape that wasn't abstract, an animal shape, four-legged, with a neck that curved up, not detailed, not artistic, just clear enough to read. Jared stood very still, looking at it for a moment. Then he said, quietly, the way he said things when he was actually impressed, "No way." I didn't say anything. I was looking at the handprints. The pigment had soaked into the rock over a very long time. It wasn't on the surface. It was part of the surface. The way old paint becomes part of a wall after enough decades. You stop being able to tell where the stone ends and the pigment begins. I pulled out my phone and tried to take a picture. The headlamp wasn't enough. The image came back as a gray blur. I tried again with the flashlight angled from the side and got something. Not a great photo, but enough to see the shapes if you knew what you were looking at. We stood there for a while, long enough that my breathing slowed down and the space started to feel less unfamiliar, long enough that the sound of the dripping started to feel normal, long enough that the airflow against my face became background. Past the painted section, the passage continued, narrower, with the ceiling dipping again, bending left before straightening. The headlamps didn't reach far in that direction. Just a few feet of lit stone, and then a dark that was total. I looked at the darkness and felt the airflow again, coming from somewhere in that direction, carrying the closed-off smell with it. We stood there looking at the passage for a moment without speaking. Then Jared moved forward, and I followed, because that's what we did. The passage past the paintings felt different in a way that was hard to explain without sounding like you were trying to make it into something. It was just narrower. The ceiling came back down. The walls pressed in closer on both sides, close enough that my shoulders brushed stone if I didn't keep my arms in front of me. The floor was wetter here, not standing water, but a constant damp that made every step feel slightly uncertain, like the ground was deciding whether to hold. Jared kept moving at the same pace he always did, which was slightly too fast for the conditions. I stayed close behind him, watching where he stepped and trying to put my feet in the same places. The headlamp beams moved with us, casting shadows that shifted direction every few seconds as we turned and ducked and adjusted. After a while, you stop noticing the shadows. They become part of the texture of the place, like the dripping and the cold. The passage bent left, then curved back right in a shallow arc that meant we were probably following a natural weakness in the rock. The path water had taken at some point, cutting through the softer layers over a very long time. The floor had that smoothed down quality in certain spots, rounded and shallow, like the bottom of a dry stream bed. At one point, the ceiling dropped low enough that I had to get down to hands and knees for about 6 feet. My headlamp scraped the rock above me. My knees found every sharp edge on the floor. When it opened back up, I stood and took a breath that felt more deliberate than usual. The kind of breath you take when your body has been waiting for more space without telling you. Jared looked back at me. He didn't say anything. He just kept going. The smell had been building gradually enough that I almost didn't notice it shifting. At the entrance, it was cold mineral and closed-off earth. By the time we were 100 feet in it, had picked up something else underneath, sour and faint, like something biological that had been sitting in still air for a long time. Not strong enough to stop you, strong enough to register. I breathed through my mouth for a stretch, and it helped a little. The smell coated the back of my throat either way. We followed the passage for another few minutes before it opened up. The chamber wasn't large, maybe 30 feet across at the widest point, irregular in shape, with the ceiling high enough in the center to stand comfortably and sloping down toward the edges. The walls were rougher here than in the passage, less smoothed, with jutting angles and deep shadow pockets that the headlamps didn't fully reach. The floor had a section near the middle that looked different from the rest, lower and darker, like it had settled or given way at some point. Jared stopped just inside the entrance and swept his light around. He did a full, slow arc, the way you do when you're taking inventory of a space. I came in behind him and did the same. The place felt still in a way that was distinct from regular quiet, like the air hadn't moved in a long time, like whatever sound existed in the chamber had been the same sounds for a very long time. Just the dripping, just the faint movement of our own presence, disturbing something that had been undisturbed. The airflow I'd noticed earlier was present here too, coming from somewhere I couldn't immediately identify, cooler than the rest of the air, and carrying that leaf and soil smell that meant a connection to the surface somewhere. Not close, not far, just present, like a reminder. Jared moved toward the far side of the chamber. I started to follow, and then my headlamp caught something near the base of the far wall, and I stopped walking. At first, the shape didn't resolve into anything specific. It was just a pale, irregular mass in the lower part of my light beam, partially in shadow, partially obscured by a low outcrop of rock. I moved the light slightly, and the shape changed. It was bone, not one bone, a collection of them, piled loosely near the base of the wall, the way things end up in a corner when they've been there for a long time. Not stacked, not arranged, just accumulated. Long bones, thick enough to be from something large. Curved sections that curved the way ribs curve, smaller pieces that had broken apart and lay separately from the rest. I stood very still for a moment, looking at them. Jared. He came over and stood beside me. He looked at the pile for a few seconds without speaking. "That's a lot of bones," he said. It was. The pile was bigger than it had looked from across the chamber. When I moved closer and crouched, I could see it more clearly. The long bones were dense, with thick walls, not deer bones. Too thick for a deer. Too large for a raccoon or anything smaller. The rib sections were broad and arching. Some of the pieces had ends that were ragged and uneven, in the way that bone gets when something has been working at it. There were smaller bones mixed in, thin, hollow ones. Some that curved in ways that made my brain offer the word bird, and then take it back. And near the back of the pile, partially behind a flat piece of rock that had fallen against the wall at some point, something that read as a jaw, not a deer jaw, not the right shape. I crouched lower and looked at it without touching it. The shape was wrong for anything I could immediately name, and my brain kept trying to offer comparisons and then backing away from them. "Bear den," Jared said from behind me. He didn't sound like he was committing to the idea, I looked at the accumulation again, the way things were distributed, the way some pieces had ended up separated from others, rolled a few feet away, like they'd been moved after the fact. "Bears don't collect bones," I said. He didn't answer that. I straightened up and looked around the chamber again, slower this time. The shadows at the edges felt heavier now that I knew what was in the room. Not different, just harder to look past without wondering. "We should go," I said. Jared nudged one of the long bones with the toe of his boot. He pulled his foot back almost immediately, like the contact had given him information he didn't want. "Yeah," he said. We turned back toward the passage we'd entered from. That was when I heard it. It was quiet enough that for a moment I thought I'd imagined it. My brain tried to label it immediately. Water echo, a bat somewhere, Jared's breathing at a different pitch. It ran through the list fast, the way your brain does when it wants to resolve something before you have time to sit with it. None of the labels fit. It was soft, short, breathy, with a slight wet quality to it, like the sound a person makes when they're trying not to laugh. It came from the passage ahead of us, the one we'd walked through to get here. Somewhere back in the corridor, between us and the way out. Jared had gone very still. His headlamp beam was pointed straight ahead, fixed on the dark opening of the passage. I didn't move either. The sound came again. The same quality, the same length. Slightly closer, or the cave was carrying it differently now that I was paying attention. I stood there, and my body ran through its options. My heart had picked up without me asking it to. My hands were at my sides, and I was aware of both of them in a way I hadn't been before. "Hello?" Jared said. I looked at him. He'd said it out loud, toward the passage, in a normal tone of voice, like he was checking if someone was in the next room. The sound stopped. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Just the dripping. Just the faint movement of air. Just the two of us standing in a room with a pile of old bones behind us and a dark passage in front of us that someone or something might be standing in the middle of. Then, from somewhere in the passage, a faint scuff. Not a footstep. More like something shifting its weight on stone. Something adjusting its position. Jared kept his voice low. Probably somebody else found it, like some other kids. I thought about the opening, how fresh the dirt had been around it, how there were no footprints, no sign of anyone who had come through, how even from the outside, the storm damage looked like something that had happened 2 days ago. "Nobody else came through that opening," I said. He swallowed. I heard it clearly in the quiet. "We tell them we're leaving. Just call out that we're going." "Don't," I said. "Just walk." We started toward the passage. Slow, measured steps, trying not to slip on the wet floor. Our headlamps moved with us, and the shadows at the edges of the chamber moved too, pulling back as we walked forward. I watched the passage entrance. The light from our headlamps reached the first few feet of it. The rough walls, the low ceiling, the curve to the left about 8 feet in where it bent out of sight. Just before we reached it, I stopped walking. There was a shape in the passage, not in the section I could see, just past the bend where the light didn't reach. My headlamp caught the edge of something at the very limit of its range, a pale area that was slightly different from the dark around it. the way a face is different from a shadow when you see it just barely. Then it moved. Not a lot, just a slight tilt, like a head shifting to one side. Then it came around the corner. It moved low at first, close to the ground, the way something moves when a space is tight. Then, as the passage widened, it straightened. Not fully, not the way a person straightens up, but part way into something that was hunched and long and wrong in ways that my eyes kept trying to correct and couldn't. The headlamps hit it directly. I want to be accurate about what I saw in that first moment, because the honest version is already bad enough without me adding to it. It was shaped like a person, in the way that a bad drawing of a person is shaped like a person. The proportions were close to human, close enough that your brain goes there first. But the arms were too long, with elbows that sat lower on the body than they should have. The legs were wrong too. Not dramatically, just slightly, like the joints had a wider range than they were supposed to. The torso was narrow and the shoulders were high. The skin was pale, not sick pale, not the kind of pale that comes from being indoors too long. This was the pale of something that had not been in light in a very long time. Thin in places. In a few spots along the ribs, I could see the shape of bone beneath it. The head was narrow, bald. The skull had a compressed look to it, like it had been formed under pressure. The eyes were small and deep-set, and when my light hit them, they reflected, not the bright eyeshine of an animal, but something lower, wetter, like glass with a film on it. The mouth was too wide. That was the part my eyes kept returning to and kept not being able to fully process. The corners extended further back than a human mouth does, and even in the first second of looking at it, with it closed, I could see the way the skin was pulled at the edges, like the structure underneath was built for a wider opening than the face could comfortably contain. It looked at us. Then it smiled. Not a human smile. Not any expression I have a good word for. Just the corners of that too wide mouth pulling back slowly, deliberately, with no other part of the face moving. The inside of my chest went cold. Beside me, Jared made a sound. Not a word, not quite a noise. Something caught in his throat, like he had tried to speak, and the air had gone the wrong way. The creature stayed still for a moment, just watching us, tilting its head slightly to one side, then the other, in a way that looked like curiosity, but didn't feel like curiosity. Then it made the sound. The giggle again, from right in front of us now. The source obvious, I coming out of that too wide mouth in a breathy, wet, wrong way that no human throat produces. It was the kind of sound that goes straight past your thinking brain and hits something older and deeper. Something that knows, before you can reason it out, that whatever is making this sound does not operate by the same rules you do. I said very quietly, "Back." And we went back into the chamber. We backed into the chamber, and the creature followed us in. It moved differently in the open space. In the passage, it had been compressed, tucked in, moving with the kind of efficiency something uses when it knows a space well. In the chamber, it spread out. The arms came away from the body slightly. The head lifted. It took up more room than its size should have accounted for, the way a presence can fill a space beyond its physical edges when everything about it is wrong enough. It stopped about 10 feet from us and stood there. I was aware of everything in the room at the same time. The bone pile behind us and to the left. The passage behind the creature, which was the way out. The smaller opening on the far side of the chamber that I had noticed earlier, but not focused on. Tight, half hidden behind a rock column, barely visible in the peripheral range of my headlamp. The distance between me and Jared, close enough to grab, and the way my injured shoulder was already aching from the crawl through the passage, and how I hadn't registered that until right now. The creature looked between the two of us, not fast, slowly, like it was deciding something without urgency. Then it tilted its head again and produced the giggle, and this time I could see exactly where it came from. The mouth opened slightly, just the front of it, and the sound came out wet and rounded, like it was being made somewhere deeper in the throat than normal speech. The jaw barely moved. The sound didn't need much space to come out. It took a step toward us, not a lunge. One step, measured, like it was testing what we would do. Jared moved first. He swung his arm out in front of him, the way you do when you want something to know you're there without committing to anything. An instinctive warning motion. The creature stopped. Its eyes moved to Jared's arm and then back to his face. Its expression didn't change in any way I could read. Then it made a sound that was not the giggle. It was lower, with more shape to it, more internal structure. The way speech has structure, with the sound rising and falling and moving through different positions in the mouth. I couldn't understand it at first. It was close to language, but not language, the way an impression of a foreign language sounds when you've never heard it before. You can tell it has rhythm and meaning and pattern, but none of it resolves into anything you can hold. Then it shifted. The sounds changed. Still wrong, still distorted, but suddenly carrying a shape I recognized. It was Jared's voice, not a clean reproduction, not the way a recording sounds, more like something had heard Jared speak for the past 40 minutes and had built a rough model of it from the outside, using the wrong materials. The pitch was close. The cadence was close. The specific way Jared's voice moved when he was being casual, on that slight drop at the end of sentences. It had that. It said, "You're an idiot." Jared's exact words from earlier, when I'd said something about cave cow, said back at us in a version of Jared's voice that was just wrong enough to make the recognition worse, not better. Jared's face did something I didn't have a word for. His expression shifted through several things in about 2 seconds. Surprise, confusion, the beginning of something that looked like he was about to speak. Then it settled into a kind of blankness that meant his brain had received information it didn't know what to do with. The creature's mouth pulled back again. It took 2 more steps forward, faster than the first one. Jared swung at it. A full arm swing, the kind you throw when you're not thinking about technique and just want something to move away from you. It connected, or almost did. The creature dropped its head, and the blow glanced off its shoulder with a sound that was duller than expected, like hitting something that didn't have the give of normal muscle. The creature didn't react the way something in pain reacts. It reacted the way something reacts when it's been interrupted. Its head snapped up. Its eyes moved to Jared. I had my flashlight in my right hand, and I hit it. Swung the plastic tube across the side of its head, a solid connection that sent a shock up my arm. Its head turned toward me. The eyes found my face. For 1 second, it just looked at me. Then it lunged. It moved fast in a way that wasn't the same as a person moving fast. When a person moves fast, their weight shifts first, and then the rest of them follows. This didn't do that. The whole thing moved at once, like the decision and the action were the same thing with no mechanical delay between them. I threw myself sideways. Not far enough. Its hand caught my forearm. The fingers wrapped and the nails, dark, uneven, longer than they should have been, bit through my jacket and into the skin underneath. Not deep, but immediate and sharp, a bright line of pain that ran from my wrist to my elbow and made my hand seize up involuntarily. I yanked my arm back and the grip broke, but the pulling motion threw me into the wall. My shoulder hit stone, and the pain that went through it was different from the nail pain. Heavier, a deep socket impact that made my vision blur for a moment and took the strength out of that side of my body. I got my back against the wall and stayed there. The creature's attention moved back to Jared. Jared had moved toward the passage while it was dealing with me. He was almost to the entrance when the creature turned. It covered the distance between them in a way that I watched and still couldn't fully account for. Not quite running, but faster than running in a space that size, like it had a different relationship with the ground. It caught him around the middle with both arms. Jared yelled. His boots hit the floor and scraped and kicked. He got one hand on the creature's arm and pulled, and it didn't move. He got the other hand on its shoulder and shoved, and that didn't move either. I pushed off the wall and grabbed his wrist with my good hand and pulled. For a moment, there were 3 of us in a single point of tension. Me pulling one direction, the creature holding the other. Jared in the middle, kicking and twisting and making sounds that weren't words. The creature's strength was the part that stayed with me afterward. Not because it was violent, because it was indifferent. It wasn't straining. It wasn't bracing or adjusting or working against me. It was simply holding the way a wall holds, like the resistance wasn't effort, just property. My shoulder gave. The joint had taken the wall impact and hadn't recovered, and when the pull reached it, the pain closed my hand before I told it to. I lost his wrist. Jared looked at me. It was a short look. His headlamp was still on, and the light hit his face from below, and I could see him clearly. He wasn't panicking anymore. The yelling had stopped. He looked like someone who had just understood something very quickly and didn't have time to say it. Then the creature dragged him backward into the passage. It moved fast. Jared's boots scraped the floor and then skipped over it, and then they were both in the passage, and his headlamp beam bounced off the walls and ceiling, and then it was just light, and then it was less light, and then the sound of his boots scraping changed to something muffled, like the cave was putting distance between us faster than the physical distance explained. The sound lasted about 10 seconds. Then it was gone. Not faded. Gone. The way a phone call ends. I stood in the chamber with my back against the wall and my headlamp pointing at the passage entrance and my right arm against my chest and my forearm burning and my shoulder a steady, deep ache that I was trying not to focus on. The dripping continued. The cold continued. The faint airflow moved through the chamber from somewhere and touched the sweat on my face. I stood there for a long time. I don't know how long. long enough that my legs started shaking from holding still. My first instinct was to go in after them. I took one step toward the passage and stopped, because from somewhere inside it, past the bend, in the section that my light didn't reach, there was the giggle again, not moving toward me, not retreating, just there, sitting in the dark like it had parked itself in the passage and was waiting to see what I would do. I looked at the passage for another few seconds. I thought about Jared's face. I thought about what the creature had done with his voice before it grabbed him, the way it had used his own words back at him, and the expression Jared had made when he heard it. Then I turned and looked at the rest of the chamber. The small opening on the far side, half hidden behind the rock column, was still there. Dark, tight, angled slightly downward at the entrance before leveling off. I had no way of knowing where it went. I had no way of knowing if it connected to anything or just ended after 10 feet in solid rock. What I knew was that the passage back to the entrance was where the creature was, somewhere in the dark between me and the outside, and it was not moving toward me, and it was not moving away. I crossed the chamber and got down on my knees and looked into the smaller opening. The headlamp showed rock on 3 sides and a floor that sloped down before flattening. Past the first few feet, I couldn't see a bend or an end. Just passage, just dark. I went in. The rock scraped my back and my injured shoulder immediately. I moved on my elbows to take the weight off it, and that was slightly better. The floor under my hands was cold and wet, small stones pressing into my palms. My right forearm dragged across the ground, and the pain from the scratches spiked each time. The passage ran tight for about 20 feet. I kept my head turned to one side and breathed through my mouth. The smell was worse in here. The sour, stale quality had thickened, like the air was older and hadn't mixed with anything fresh in a long time. Behind me, I heard it. Not the giggle this time. A scrape. Something entering the opening after me, moving across stone with a sound that was not like hands and knees on rock. Something that dragged and shifted in a different pattern. I moved faster. My elbows found every sharp edge on the floor. My knees found them after. A warm sensation spread across my right forearm where the nails had been, slow and wet, and I knew the wounds were open again, but there was nothing to do about that in a 3-foot passage in the dark. The scraping behind me got closer. It wasn't rushing. That was the part that registered and stayed. It was moving at a steady pace, the same pace it had used in the chamber, the same pace it had used in the corridor, like it knew the gap between us was fine, like it had made this calculation before, and the calculation always came out the same way. The passage bent slightly, and the ceiling dipped, and I had to flatten completely for a few feet, pressing my chest to the ground, pulling myself forward with my fingertips. My headlamp bumped and skewed sideways, and for a second, the light went mostly into the rock wall, and I was moving almost blind. Then the ceiling came back up, and I was crawling again, and the passage widened. 20 feet further, it opened into another chamber, smaller than the first, taller, with the ceiling rising to maybe 8 feet in the center. The walls were smoother here, with a rounded, worn quality that matched what happened when water moved through a space for a very long time. The floor was mostly flat, with a shallow depression in the center that held still water, black and reflective under the headlamp. I got to my feet and turned to face the opening I'd come through. Nothing there yet. The air in this chamber was different, cooler, and the airflow was stronger here, noticeably directional, coming from somewhere in the far side of the chamber, carrying that surface smell clearly, leaves and soil and moving air from above ground. Not close, but real. An actual connection to outside, somewhere ahead. I swept my headlamp across the walls. There were marks here too, not handprints, figures, drawn in the same dark pigment as the handprints in the corridor, but different in what they showed. Stick-limbed shapes with elongated bodies, some grouped, some isolated. Some of the shapes read as human, proportioned closely enough. Others were drawn differently. Longer arms, narrower heads, joints at angles that didn't match the human shapes beside them. One figure was larger than the rest, positioned near the center of the grouping. Wide mouth, rendered as a single broad stroke. Small eyes, just 2 marks. Long arms hanging past where a waist would be on the human shapes. Below it, smaller figures, posed differently from the others, lower to the ground, arms raised. I looked at the large figure and felt my stomach move in a way that had nothing to do with nausea, just recognition, and the thing that comes with recognition when you don't want it. Then I heard the scraping in the passage. I looked around the chamber, and the far side had a passage opening, taller than the one I'd come through, narrower, with a strong draw of air moving through it. The airflow was coming from there. The surface smell was coming from there. I went toward it. From the crawlspace entrance behind me, the sound changed. The scraping became something faster, not panicked, purposeful, like it had been patient and was now done being patient. I moved through the passage fast, one arm against the wall for balance, my headlamp bouncing. The floor sloped upward, gradually at first, then steeper. The walls closed in and I was turned sideways, edging forward with my back against one wall and my chest brushing the other. The slope increased. I was climbing more than walking, using my hands on the rock above me to pull. My shoulder sent pain down my arm every time I grabbed, but I kept grabbing. The air was moving against me now, pushing down from above. Cool, and with that clear outside smell that was completely different from everything below, full and moving and real. I could hear it now. The creature, behind me and below, moving up the slope. Still not rushing. Still at that same deliberate pace. The sound of it was wrong even at a distance. A pattern of movement that didn't match anything I could picture without seeing it. The passage narrowed to a crack, and I had to angle my head sideways and push through with one arm first. Rock pressed my chest and my back simultaneously, and I exhaled completely to make myself smaller and felt myself move. Then light, not headlamp light. Gray, thin, coming from above. The flat, dim light of an overcast October afternoon filtered through leaves and roots and about 4 feet of loose earth above me. I was in a chute, nearly vertical. Dirt walls with roots running through them, a crack of sky at the top maybe 10 feet up. I jammed my boots against the walls and pushed with my back and climbed. Dirt fell into my face. Roots came loose in my hands and I grabbed others. My shoulder was past pain and into something that was just heat and noise that I had stopped processing. The sound below me changed. The creature had reached the base of the chute. I heard it below me, and then I heard it start to climb. I climbed faster. My hand hit surface. Dead leaves, cold ground. the solid flat of the forest floor. I grabbed a root as thick as my wrist and pulled, and the sky opened up above me, fully, gray and wide and real. I came out face first onto dead leaves and rolled to the side and got my back against a tree. I looked at the chute. The creature was in the opening, just its head and the top of its shoulders, framed by dirt and roots, its pale face tilted up at me from below. The small, wet eyes, that mouth. It looked at me. It did not come out. I watched it watching me for a long moment, my chest heaving, my arms streaked with dried and fresh blood, my shoulder an ongoing fact I was putting off dealing with. It reached up with one hand, slowly, without breaking eye contact, and pressed its palm flat against the dirt beside the opening, left a dark, smeared print against the soil, like the ones on the cave walls. Then it lowered its hand. It stayed there for another second, looking at me. Then it went back down into the dark. I don't remember the walk back to the truck clearly. Not in the way that memory usually works, where you can move through it in sequence and find the details if you look. It's more like a series of still images with nothing connecting them. A fallen log I had to step over twice because I misjudged the height. A section of creek that I crossed without remembering deciding to cross it. The sound of my own breathing, too loud and too fast, in a woods that had gone completely quiet around me. The light was low by the time I reached the gate. Not dark yet, but the kind of late afternoon gray that makes everything look like it's already over. The rusty chain between the two posts, the plywood sign, the no fun scrawl underneath it in permanent marker that I'd walked past 100 times before. I stood in front of it for a second and felt my eyes go hot. And then I kept walking because stopping wasn't going to do anything useful. Jared's truck was at the pull-off where we'd left it. Silver, dented rear quarter panel, a crack running most of the way across the lower windshield that he'd been meaning to fix since spring. The keys were in his jacket pocket, somewhere underground. I found a rock the size of a softball near the edge of the gravel and broke the driver's window with it. The alarm didn't go off because the alarm hadn't worked in years. I reached in and unlocked the door, got in, and sat in the seat for a moment with glass on the upholstery and blood from my palm transferring onto the steering wheel. There was a spare key taped to the back of the sun visor. His uncle had put it there after the second time Jared locked himself out. I peeled it off, got the engine started on the third try because the truck always needed 3 tries when it was cold, and pulled out onto the road. I drove back to town the way you drive when your hands are working, but your brain is somewhere else entirely. I stayed on the road. I stopped at the one traffic light. I turned onto my street and then turned around because I couldn't go home. Not yet. Not without doing something first. I drove to the edge of town where the cell service started and called 911 from the pull-off by the old grain elevator. The operator was calm and clear and asked me to describe my location, and I gave it to her. She asked what happened. I told her my friend had been taken. She asked taken by what? I said I didn't know how to describe it. She asked if he had been taken by a person. I said it was not a person. She asked me to stay where I was and told me units were on the way, and I said okay, and sat in the truck with my arm on the door and watched the road. The deputies arrived in 2 cars. A volunteer fire truck came a few minutes after. A guy from the search and rescue outfit in the next county showed up in a personal vehicle with a reflective vest and a pack. I sat on the tailgate of one of the deputy vehicles and told them what happened. The older deputy, gray mustache, neutral expression, wrote things down. He asked clarifying questions in a tone that stayed even throughout, the kind of professional evenness that's practiced specifically to not give anything away. The younger one stood slightly back and listened. I told them about the storm opening, the passage, the paintings, the bones, the chamber, the creature, Jared being taken into the passage, the second opening, the figures on the walls, the chute, what I saw at the top of the chute before I ran. When I was done, the older deputy looked at his notes for a moment. Then he looked at my forearm, which was visible where my jacket sleeve had ridden up, the scratches dark and dried in a row across the skin. Then he looked at my jeans. I had forgotten about my jeans. The warmth had gone cold a long time ago, and I had stopped registering it, but now I was aware of it again. He didn't say anything about it. He asked if I needed medical attention. I said my shoulder felt wrong. He had the fire guys check it. One of them, a heavy-set man with a calm manner, had me move my arm through a range of motion and then told me the joint was likely partially separated, not fully dislocated, and that I needed a hospital, but it would hold for now if I kept it still. He wrapped it, and I sat with my arm against my chest and watched them gear up to go into the woods. They went in with good lights and a full team. I gave them the best description I could of the location and the general direction. The older deputy stayed with me. We sat in the truck with the engine running and the heat on, and he asked me the same questions again in a different order, on the way you do when you want to see if the answers change. They didn't change. He wrote that down too. An hour and a half later, the team came back out. They had found the storm opening. They had found the first passage. They had found the paintings, which one of them had photographed. They had found the chamber with the bone pile, which they had marked and not touched. They had not found Jared. They had not found the second opening in the chamber, or the crawl space, or the second chamber with the figures on the walls. When I described those again, the search and rescue man said the cave system might have more branches than they'd covered in one pass, and they would go back with better equipment in the morning. The older deputy drove me to the hospital. He sat in the waiting room while they x-rayed my shoulder, cleaned and stitched the forearm lacerations, and rebandaged my hand. The shoulder was a partial separation, which meant they manipulated it back. I wrapped it, gave me a sling, told me to follow up in 3 days, and sent me home with instructions I don't remember reading. The deputy dropped me at my house at 11:30 at night. I went inside, locked both locks on the front door, and sat in the kitchen under the overhead light with a glass of water I didn't drink. The next few days had a particular texture to them that's hard to describe. Everything was technically normal. I was in my house, in my town, doing ordinary things, getting the shoulder seen to, taking the antibiotics they gave me for the lacerations, answering calls, talking to Jared's mom once, which was the hardest phone call I have ever had, and which I am not going to describe in detail because it belongs to her and not to this story. The search went back in twice more. They brought a structural engineer the second time to assess the cave system. They found the crawlspace entrance in the back of the first chamber. They found it blocked about 15 feet in by a section of collapsed ceiling that the engineer said looked like it could have come down recently, within days. They could not safely pass it. They found no trace of Jared past the first chamber. 2 days after the first search, I showed them where I had come out. The chute was gone. The hillside had slumped after I climbed out, the loose dirt and the disturbed roots giving way the way that kind of soil gives way when you remove the support structure. The crack was sealed, packed solid, and the engineer said excavating it safely would require equipment and time, and was not guaranteed to find a stable void behind it. The case stayed open. The cave entrance got covered with plywood and sandbags. The town put up a new sign at the gate. Search parties went out on weekends for a while. Volunteers with orange vests covering the trails in a grid pattern, looking for anything that might have made it to the surface. They found nothing. During all of this, I was doing the practical things you do when something has happened and the world hasn't stopped moving. Filing a formal statement, talking to a counselor once at the insistence of a deputy who seemed genuinely concerned about me, eating food that people brought, sleeping in short stretches that ended when I woke up convinced I could hear something at the window. The thing with the sleep was the first indication that something wasn't right that I couldn't attribute to shock or stress. It wasn't the nightmares. Nightmares made sense. My brain had taken in something that didn't fit any category it had, and it was working on it the way brains work on unresolved things, which is noisily and at inconvenient hours. That part I accepted. What I didn't accept was the sound. 3 nights after I got home, I woke up at about 2 a.m. with the complete and immediate certainty that there was something in the corner of my bedroom. Not a dream certainty. Not the kind of fear that dissolves when you turn the light on. The kind that's specific and located and persists while you're fully awake. I turned the lamp on. The corner was empty. I sat with the lamp on until morning. The next night, it happened again. Same corner, same time. I turned the light on, and the corner was empty, and I sat there until my alarm went off. The third night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the living room with every light in the house on and watched the windows and listened to the house settle and tried to read something on my phone without being able to retain any of it. By the 4th night, I was so tired that I fell asleep in the armchair in the living room around 3 a.m, just tipped sideways and went, and I slept until 9 without waking up once. I told myself the armchair was better, that being in a different room helped. I started sleeping there most nights. The hand was the next thing. The lacerations on my forearm healed at a normal rate. The stitches stayed in. The redness reduced. The tissue closed the way tissue is supposed to. The doctor at the follow-up said it looked fine, and we talked about scar care. The cuts on my palm, from where the creature's nails had dragged across the heel of my hand when I lost Jared's wrist, were smaller and shallower. They had bled more than they should have for their size, but had closed on their own, and the follow-up doctor had barely commented on them. But the palm didn't feel right. Not the cuts themselves, the hand, the sensation in it. Starting about 5 days after I got home, my left palm had a different quality to it than it had before. Not numb, more like the top layer of sensation had been muted slightly, like wearing thin rubber gloves. When I touched something with that hand, I could feel it, but there was a distance to it that hadn't been there before. Cold felt less cold. texture felt less specific. I pressed my right palm against my left and felt the right hand normally, but the left hand felt it through something, a layer I couldn't locate or explain. I told myself it was nerve irritation from the wounds. Then the dots appeared. I had checked the palm wound regularly because that was what the discharge instructions said to do, watching for the redness and heat that meant infection. On the 8th day, I peeled the bandage off and the wound looked fine, closed, clean, a little pink at the edges. But there were 3 small marks near the upper edge of the healed cut that had not been there the day before. Very small, slightly darker than the surrounding skin. Placed in an irregular triangle, close together, I pressed on them. No pain, no raised texture, no heat. I looked at them under my phone flashlight. They were under the skin, not on top of it. Not bruises. Bruises are diffuse and mottled and sit at a different depth. These were precise, like 3 small points of pigment below the surface. I held my phone with my good hand and took a photo, and then looked at the photo. They were clear in the image. 3 small, dark marks, symmetrical enough to look deliberate. I put the bandage back on. I told myself a lot of things over the next few days. That they were a bruise, that something in the cave water had gotten into the cut and caused a localized discoloration, that the wound had healed irregularly, and this was what that looked like. What I didn't do was tell anyone. Not the follow-up doctor, not my cousin, not any of the deputies I spoke to during the ongoing search coordination calls, because there was no version of saying it out loud that didn't end with someone looking at me the way the older deputy had looked at my jeans. 12 days after the cave, I drove to work for the first time since it happened. My cousin had held my shifts without making a formal issue of it, the way you do for someone when something bad has happened. But I was running out of reasons to stay home that weren't just, I don't want to be in public yet. The warehouse job was good for not thinking, moving, lifting with my good arm, following a checklist. My headlamp, which I had put back in my jacket pocket at the hospital and found there a week later when I finally emptied the jacket, I moved to the glove box of my truck. I didn't take it out of the truck. I just wanted to know where it was. I drove home from the late shift on a Thursday night, 2 weeks after Jared disappeared. The road home passed the edge of the school property, where the woods started behind the back fence. I drove that stretch every day. I'd driven it the day before without noticing anything. That night, my headlights swept across the tree line as I rounded the curve, and I saw something. A shape between the trees at the far edge of the light. At first, it read as a post, something tall and narrow and vertical that was part of the fence line. Then it wasn't in the right place for a post, and it wasn't the right shape. Too thin, too tall, with a slight forward lean at the top, the way something leans when it's looking at something. I kept driving. I watched the rearview mirror until the tree line disappeared in the dark behind me. I got home and parked and sat in the truck for a few minutes before going inside. In the kitchen, I drank water and stood at the counter and told myself it was a post, a shadow, a tree that I'd never noticed, the way your brain will take any available shape and give it the outline of something you're afraid of when you're tired and primed for it. I stood at the counter until my heart rate came down. Then my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I looked at the screen for 3 full rings. Then I answered. The line was quiet for a moment, just the faint texture of an open connection, the mild static of a call that's traveling some distance. Then, from somewhere inside that static, a voice. Bro. One word, stretched slightly at the end, the way Jared stretched it when he was setting up something dumb he was about to say. But wrong. The pitch was close, but the texture was off, like the voice was being produced by something that had learned it from the outside and was running it through a different set of mechanics. My hand went tight around the phone. Jared, I said. It came out as a whisper, a pause. The static breathed, then the giggle, soft, brief, coming through the phone speaker pressed against my ear in the quiet of my kitchen. Then the voice again, clearer, more practiced, like it had spent time on this particular phrase. Come back. The call ended. I stood with the phone against my ear, listening to dead air for longer than made sense. When I lowered the phone and looked at the screen, the call log was normal. Recent calls. My cousin, a number I didn't recognize that had called twice while I was underground and turned out to be a spam call. The deputy's direct line. The unknown number was not there. Not listed as unknown. Not listed as blocked. Just not present. The call had happened. I had answered it. I had heard it. And the record of it was gone. I went through the call log 3 times. Then I looked at my palm. The 3 marks under the skin had darkened since the morning. Not dramatically, but the change was visible compared to what they'd looked like when I'd checked at noon. Deeper, like something below the surface had shifted toward the skin. I stood in the kitchen under the overhead light and looked at the marks, and felt a cold settle into me that was different from fear. Fear is loud. This was quiet. This was the feeling of understanding something you'd been trying not to understand. I went to the living room and sat on the floor. Not on the furniture. The floor, and with my back against the couch, and a clear line of sight to both the hallway and the front door. I found the baseball bat in the closet and set it across my knees. Outside, at the edge of the yard where the grass met the tree line, something pale moved behind the trunks. Not fast, not trying to close the distance, just present. Moving slowly from one side to the other behind the trees, occasionally stopping. I watched it through the window until the sky started to lighten. It was gone by the time the sun came up. I went to the window and looked at the yard. Dead grass, wet with dew. The tree line still in gray in the early light. At the edge of the yard, in the soft ground near the first row of trees, I could see marks in the soil from where I stood. I didn't go outside to look at them closely. I didn't need to. The marks in the soil were still there the next morning. I could see them from the kitchen window while the coffee brewed. 3 depressions in the soft ground near the tree line, spaced the way something spaces itself when it stands in one place for a long time, shifting weight from one foot to the other. The dew had settled into them overnight and made them darker than the surrounding ground. By mid-morning, the sun had dried the grass around them, and they were still visible. By afternoon, a light wind had moved through and disturbed the surface, and they were gone. I told myself that was better. I didn't fully believe it. The days that followed had a particular quality to them that I didn't have a good word for at the time. Everything on the surface was functioning. I was going to work. I was eating. I was answering my phone when people called. I was doing the things that make you look, from the outside, like someone who is processing something difficult but managing. Then underneath that, something had shifted in the way I understood the space I was living in. I had grown up in this town. I knew every road and every cut-through and every building that had been something else before it was what it was now. The woods had been part of the backdrop my whole life, the same way the water tower was part of the backdrop, and the grain elevator, and the church with the broken clock. You stop seeing things you've seen every day for 20 years. They become wallpaper. They weren't wallpaper anymore. Every time I drove past the tree line behind the school, I looked at it. Every time I walked to my truck in the morning, I looked at the back fence where my yard met the tree line. At work, the warehouse had a loading dock that faced west, and on clear afternoons, the tree line on the far side of the access road caught the low sun in a particular way, and I would find myself watching it from the dock while I was supposed to be doing something else. I was looking for the shape, the tall, thin silhouette with the slight forward lean. I didn't see it again for a while, and the not seeing it was almost worse than seeing it, because not seeing it just meant I didn't know where it was. The palm kept changing. By the third week, the 3 marks had darkened to the point where they were clearly visible without checking under a light. The skin above them looked normal. No swelling, no redness, no heat. Just 3 small, dark points sitting below the surface of the skin, like something embedded there. When I pressed on them individually, the sensation was different from the surrounding area. Not painful, not really feeling like pressure either. More like pressing on something that wasn't quite connected to the rest of the hand's nervous system. A slight delay in the signal. The muted quality in the rest of the palm had not resolved. If anything, it had expanded slightly. Not dramatically, just the edges of it extending a little further up toward the fingers, a little further toward the wrist. Still within the range of something I could explain away if I wanted to. Still close enough to nerve irritation or circulation issues or psychosomatic response that I could find a reasonable alternative and hold on to it. I stopped looking for reasonable alternatives around the end of the 3rd week. It was a Tuesday afternoon, an off day from work, overcast and cold with the kind of wind that comes before a proper winter sets in. I was in the kitchen doing nothing in particular when I heard something in the backyard. Not a dramatic sound, not a crash or a thud, just a sound that didn't belong. A soft, irregular movement in the leaves that had piled against the back fence. Not the sound of wind in leaves, which has a consistent direction and rhythm. The sound of something moving through leaves from below, shifting them without lifting them, the way an animal moves when it's trying not to make noise and doesn't quite succeed. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the back fence. There was nothing visible. The leaves against the fence shifted once more and then went still. I stood there for about 5 minutes without moving, watching the fence line. Then, from somewhere outside, not at the fence, not from the yard, but further back, in the trees beyond the fence, I heard the giggle. Faint, very faint, the kind of sound that the wind could have covered if the wind had been blowing in the right direction. Brief, and then gone. I stepped back from the window. My hand found the edge of the counter behind me, and I gripped it and stood there with my heart moving in my chest and the kitchen silent around me. The sound did not come again. I stayed in the kitchen for the rest of the afternoon. That night, I did two things I had been putting off. The first was calling the older deputy, and the one with the gray mustache who had taken my statement in the field and driven me to the hospital. I had his direct number from the follow-up coordination calls. I called it, and he answered on the second ring. I told him that I had heard something in my backyard. I told him I had seen marks in the soil near the tree line a week prior. I told him I'd heard something in the woods at the edge of my property. He was quiet for a moment after I said that. Then he said he'd send someone to drive past the property a couple of times that night, and he'd follow up with me in the morning. He did both of those things. A patrol car made passes at roughly 2-hour intervals through the night. In the morning, the deputy called and told me they hadn't seen anything unusual. He asked how I was sleeping. I told him not well. He mentioned again that the department had a referral for a counselor and that the offer was still open. I thanked him and got off the phone. The second thing I did that night was go online and look up the history of the woods. Not the trail system, not the park department records. Older than that. It took a while because the town's history wasn't well documented in any single place. It was spread across a local historical society's website that hadn't been updated since the early 2000s, a digitized collection of old county newspapers that had patchy coverage, and a few scanned documents from a library archive that required patience to navigate. What I found wasn't dramatic. There was no single event, no headline, no named incident. What there was, spread across a range of sources covering about 150 years, was a pattern. Missing persons. Not many. 4 or 5 with enough detail to read clearly. A few more that were vague enough to be anything. The oldest was from the 1880s. A farmhand who had gone into the back section of the woods to clear brush and not come back. The search at the time had found nothing. The newspaper account was 3 sentences, then one in the 1920s. A teenager. Same general area of the woods. Same result. Then a gap of several decades. Then 2 in the 1970s, within a few years of each other. One was ruled a probable drowning in the creek, though no body had been found. The other was listed as a runaway, though the family apparently never accepted that. Then a gap. Then Jared. None of it proved anything. People went missing in rural areas for all kinds of reasons, and a handful of cases spread across 150 years wasn't a pattern in any statistical sense. But they clustered in the same section of the woods, and none of them had ever produced a body, and the searches in each case had come back with nothing beyond the point where the trails ended. I found one other thing. In a scanned copy of a county history booklet published in the 1960s by someone who had been cataloging local folklore. It was not a scholarly document. It was the kind of thing a local history enthusiast puts together on a home typewriter, with inconsistent formatting and no source citations. But there was a paragraph near the end, in a section about indigenous history in the county, that mentioned the woods. The writer noted that the area had been considered significant and avoided by the people who had lived in the region before European settlement. The word they had used, according to the author, who was citing a secondary source that no longer seemed to exist, translated roughly as something like the place beneath, or the place that goes down. The author had written this in a slightly dismissive tone, the way people in that era wrote about things they considered superstition, and had moved on to the next paragraph without elaborating. I read that paragraph 4 times. Then I closed the browser and sat in the dark of my living room for a long time. The place beneath. I thought about the cave system, the way it had gone down, passage after passage, each level colder and older, the air that had moved through it from somewhere below, the low, steady circulation of something vast, the bones in the chamber that had been there long enough to lose their context entirely, and the figures on the walls, not decorative, not narrative in any way I could read as storytelling, but functional looking, like instructions or records. The large figure with the wide mouth and the small eyes, painted in the same dark pigment as the handprints. The smaller figures below it, arms raised. The creature, moving through the rock like it owned the architecture. And the handprint it had left on the soil at the edge of the chute when I came out. The deliberate press of its palm against the outside world, leaving a mark the same way the marks on the cave walls had been left. I kept coming back to that. The handprint on the dirt. The way it had looked at me while it made it. The way it had retreated afterward, back into the dark, without following me out. It had not followed me out. It had come to the boundary and stopped. I had been turning this over for weeks without letting myself finish the thought. Now, I finished it, on the woods behind the town. The way nobody went deep into them. Not really. Not without turning back before they got too far in. The evil spirits phrase, used for generations without anyone being able to say what they actually meant. The pattern of disappearances, clustered in the same area, producing no bodies, no evidence, no resolution. The place that goes down. Something lived there, deep in the rock, in passages that the cave surveys didn't reach and the maps didn't show. Something old, and that had been there long enough to appear on the walls in pigment that had soaked into the stone, long enough to feature in folklore that had been old when the first Europeans arrived and wrote it down without understanding it. Something that stayed down, that came to the edges and stopped, that left marks on the boundary and retreated. Most of the time. When I went back to sleep that night, in the armchair, all the lights on the baseball bat across my knees where I'd stopped bothering to put it away, I woke up at 2 a.m, not from a nightmare, but from a sound. The phone, face down on the floor where I must have put it without remembering. I picked it up. Unknown number. Same format as the last time. No area code. Just digits that didn't resolve into anything recognizable. I sat with it buzzing in my hand and looked at the front door and the hallway and the window above the couch that looked out over the front yard. I answered. The static was the same as before. The open line texture, the faint breath of a signal traveling. This time, there was no voice first. Just a long pause, long enough that I thought maybe it had dropped, or the other end was waiting for me to speak. Then the giggle. Slow. 3 short sounds. Unhurried. The wet, breathy quality coming through the speaker with a clarity that made the hair on my arms stand up. Then the voice. Jared's voice, closer to accurate this time than it had been during the first call. It had been practicing. I could tell because the rhythm was smoother, the pitch more consistent, the way a bad impression gets less bad the more time someone spends on it. We found something, it said, in Jared's voice, with Jared's specific way of starting a sentence like it was the middle of a conversation already in progress. I didn't say anything. Another pause. Then, quieter, the voice dropped to something that was still Jared's cadence but slower, and it said, carefully, like it had been working on this particular sentence for days, "You should see it." The call ended. I sat in the armchair until morning with the phone in my hand and the bat across my knees, the same as every night. But something was different this time, and I couldn't stop it from being different. Because it had used Jared's voice with more accuracy than before, and it had used specific words that Jared used. The exact phrasing, "We found something, you should see it." That was something Jared said, not a common phrase. His phrase, the one he used when he'd spotted something in the woods or found something interesting online, the setup line before he showed you whatever he was excited about. It had learned it from him, directly. I sat with that. The call log was empty again in the morning. No record, no number. Just the gap where it should have been. The 3 marks on my palm were darker. I looked at them under the kitchen light, pressing gently, feeling that slight dead zone response from the tissue around them. On an impulse, I got a pen and made 3 small dots on a piece of paper in the approximate spacing and position of the marks. Then I looked at the paper, and the spacing matched the spacing of the handprints in the cave. Not the full handprint, just 3 fingers pressed together, the way you'd press them if you were making a mark with the tips. I put the paper face down on the table. Outside the kitchen window, the morning was gray and still, the yard empty, the tree line at the back fence ordinary and unremarkable in the flat winter light. I looked at it for a while. The town was still the same town. The streets still had names nobody used, and the church clock was still broken. The gas station on County Road 9 was still there, and the man who ran it still said what he said about the woods, the same words in the same order, the same half-joke that was also completely serious. Evil spirits, not ghosts. Not a monster, not a haunted place with a story anyone could tell cleanly from beginning to end. Just something in the deep rock that had been there a long time and was still there, and that had learned something from Jared that it was now using, and that had left something in my palm the night it put its nails into me. Something small and dark and patient that was still changing. I have not gone back to the woods. I have not gone back to the cave. I check my palm every morning. The marks are still there. The muted sensation has not spread further in the past week, which I am choosing to take as something, though I don't know what. I sleep in the armchair most nights. I keep the lights on. I keep the bat where I can reach it. Some nights I don't hear anything from the tree line, and those nights are fine. Some nights I hear the giggle from the woods, faint and patient, like it has nowhere else to be and is not in any hurry. And some nights the phone buzzes with no number attached, and Jared's voice comes through the static, getting more accurate each time, learning the small things, the pauses, the specific words, the rhythm of how he talked when he was trying to get me to follow him somewhere I probably shouldn't go. I don't answer those calls anymore, but I keep checking the palm, and the marks keep darkening.